Now, the Colorado ballot dispute is not the only case that President Trump has now before the Supreme Court. They also agreed last week to hear arguments on the issue of presidential immunity in his D.C. case. Here now with more, Executive Director of the American Center for Law and Justice, Jordan Sekulow, is with us. They represented, by the way, the Republican Party of Colorado in the ballot case. Former Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz is with us, and Fox News legal analyst Gregg. Jarrett, Jordan, let me start with you. First, you were involved, the ACLJ was involved in this issue representing the Republican Party of Colorado. I did sense that a lot of the arguments you put forward were actually considered by justices. That was my take. Your reaction?
Yeah, we actually have a side-by-side that we put up today on our broadcast where you can see our brief and then see the majority opinion today and see kind of the language used. And I'm not saying the justices took it verbatim, but I'd be pretty excited about what our ACLJ team, our legal team, put together on this case. And I think with Justice Barrett summed it up right. All that Americans need to take away, as you said, Sean, is that all 9 justices agree that this is the wrong process, and that's it. On this matter, that states, secretaries of states, and random officials at the state level should have no role in deciding what presidential candidates on the ballot. And let's not forget, it was not just Democrats, but plenty of rhino Republicans who took the same position as those Democrats who wanted to remove President Trump from the ballot this way. And the Supreme Court told them, even 3 liberal members of the Supreme Court, no, you can't do this, 9-0. Now, on to immunity. We've done those cases. We did those cases when the president was in office, and you remember Adam Schiff was obsessed with getting his tax returns. It's all going to come down to that question presented. And I said, Jack Smith, that may have been his biggest problem with this whole issue, is the question presented that was written by the court, Sean, which says, let's look at actual official acts of the president and whether or not official acts of the president are those acts then immune from prosecution. And I could see how this case gets a decision at the Supreme Court, Sean, and then has to be sit down all the way back to a district court to decide official versus unofficial acts. And again, this not affecting President Trump in his reelection efforts.
Professor Dershowitz, on the issue of immunity, all of us agreed that the court had an obligation to take that case up, but I know, Gregg, yourself, I felt the same way. I wasn't sure that they would. Rightly, they did take that issue up. How do you see the arguments falling in that case?
Well, as you know, I predicted the outcome of this case exactly, how the court would decide 9-0 using the 5th section of the 14th Amendment. On the issue of immunity, I'm going to make a prediction here, too. I think both sides argue too broadly. I think Trump was wrong to have his lawyers say that if a president orders the SEALs to kill his opponent, he can be immunized unless he gets impeached first. That went too far. The answer should have been, of course not. Now let me explain. But I also think the lower court went way too far by having no immunity whatsoever and saying that whatever a president may have had immunity while in office, he loses that once he leaves office. I hope and I suspect that the court granted cert in this case in order to come out with a nuanced decision that focuses on precisely what are presidential acts. And if they're within the scope of presidential acts, then they have to go beyond the presidency itself. Let me give you an example. President Eisenhower in 1954 sends troops down to implement Brown versus Board of Education. One of the children or one of the police officers is killed. And the new president coming in, a Democrat, years later, wants to indict Eisenhower for having done that, even though it was in his presidential authority. I think we would all agree that there has to be some immunity, and we would all agree that he can't have total immunity for everything he did as a politician or as an individual. So I think the Supreme Court, hopefully, will come out with a nuanced decision that will give guidance to the lower courts as to when immunity is applicable, when it's not applicable. We can bring the country together on this issue as well, instead of simply having extreme views on both sides.
You know, I actually concur with what you just said, and I think, Gregg, what Professor Dershowitz is saying is that the argument of absolute immunity probably is too broad, and a more nuanced judgment of the court, I think, would probably be more appropriate in this case, and maybe even the better argument for the court. Your take?
Well, I think the Supreme Court looked at the Circuit Court decision and said, hey, you went way too far. You're dismissing any notion of immunity, even if a president acts consistent with his duties. That is absurd logically. And it's inconsistent, by the way, and this is the important part, with the Supreme Court precedent 4 decades ago that a president does have absolute immunity from civil lawsuits as long as his actions fall within the outer perimeter of his official acts. Well, you know, Sean, the exact same reasoning applies to criminal prosecutions. If it's otherwise, my goodness, the chilling effect on presidential decision-making would trigger paralysis. Instead of a chief executive,
So,
America
Gregg,
would be
if I might-
ruled by a committee of lawyers. They'd be afraid to do anything out of fear of future prosecution.
Gregg, let me ask you this. Would a more nuanced version versus the argument of absolute immunity maybe be, of course, you have freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded building? Would that be, would there be an
Exactly.
analogy there?
Yes.
And you,
And I
you would
agree
expect
with
the court to
professor.
do that?
And Jordan said this as well. I suspect the current justices will extend the existing immunity standard in civil actions to criminal cases and then remand the Trump case back to the trial court to decide whether Trump's acts are covered as official acts. And I think he has a very good argument that they are. If he believed there was election fraud, even a mistaken belief, he has a sworn duty to enforce all laws and receives
Professor,
protection.
real quick, you wanted
But it
to...
won't be unanimous. It won't be unanimous
It
this
won't be,
time.
I
This
agree.
will be a divided opinion.
Probably not.
And I suspect it will be 6-3.
I suspect you're probably right, too. You're so far 1-0. So let's see if your record holds. Thank you all for being with us. Appreciate it. Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.